Mm. We've talked about the Netflix documentary. I am hoping to speak to Aphrodite Jones next week about sort of the media reaction to the trial, the atmosphere at the time, and also why there is like sort of a guilter movement in the media that sort of far outstrips the proportion of the public that believes Michael Jackson was guilty. I mean, the latest polling shows that only about sort of 19% of people believe that Michael Jackson was guilty of any of these crimes, right? Which is the lowest, which is the minority opinion. So more people believe that he was absolutely innocent, and then more people than that are unwilling to say, as in they just don't know. We're hoping to speak to Aphrodite Jones about why that might be the case. But I do want to speak to you a little bit about the Netflix documentary, which I gather you've seen. There are a number of eye-catching claims in that documentary, Charles, and I'm just going to go through them one by one. I just want you to react to them. So, according to Diane Diamond, and I don't know that much about her personally, so perhaps you'll enlighten me. Just before a search warrant was executed for Neverland, Michael Jackson was holed up in a villa in Vegas having wild parties with teenage boys who only spoke German. That's one of the claims that comes out of the documentary. Do you know anything about that?
I know that Diane has said it. I've seen no evidence to substantiate it ever. I've never heard a single independent witness corroborate it. I've never seen any evidence of it at all. So if Diane would like to place into the public domain her actual evidence for that assertion, then great. But until she does that, it's an assertion.
Okay. Next one. So in the doc, the accuser, Gavin Arvizo, is shown saying, and this is the sheriff's footage of his interview, his testimony. So he says Michael Jackson showed him and his little brother pornography, which he kept in a black suitcase, black briefcase, maybe it was. In the documentary, the prosecutor, Ron Zonen, says that when they executed the search warrant on Neverland, this suitcase was found, which corroborates Gavin's story.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that because that pissed me off when I watched it. So, so firstly, in the documentary, Ron Zonen says that the allegation was that Michael Jackson would use the pornography to stimulate victims for abuse. That is absolutely not what the Arvizos said at all. So the two Arvizo brothers come to court and they both give wildly conflicting stories about this supposed briefcase of pornography. I forget which one is which, right? But one of them says, we walked into the room and it was there, and Michael looked irritated to see it and said, Frank Cassio must have been in my room again, picked it up and took it away.
The briefcase?
Other ones, the briefcase, yeah.
Okay, one of the brothers says that Michael was annoyed that the briefcase was there, and okay, right, got it.
Yeah. The other one says they walked into the room and it was there, Michael sat on the bed and looked through it for a couple of minutes and then put it away, right? Neither of them says he used it to stimulate them for abuse. That is a claim by Ron Zonen, which has absolutely no factual basis at all. However, firstly, both of the brothers' stories about this conflict. Secondly, they are shown to be lying about vast swathes of the rest of their story. What the defense does is it calls a litany of witnesses to testify to various pieces of information which add up to a completely different explanation. So they called witnesses who said that the Arvizos were essentially like thieves who would just go into people's houses and root around and steal things. So there was an actress, I think her name was Vernee Watson-Johnson. She said they came to my house. They absolutely tore through my house like a tornado. They had no respect for my privacy. They went through all my drawers and everything, and I never let them in my house again. There was a dentist who said they did the same thing in my office, and they actually ended up rendering unusable a bunch of sterile equipment that I had to throw away because they were going through all my stuff. There were witnesses who said that they saw the brothers going through Neverland and stealing things. So there was another child who came and gave evidence and said that they saw the Arvizo brothers going to Michael Jackson's office, and in his office he had a paperweight with something like $100 note in it, and they smashed the paperweight and stole the note. There were witnesses, child witnesses, who said that they saw the Arvizos running through the house and stealing wine out of the kitchen refrigerator. And there were a number of witnesses who said they saw the Arvizo boys going into Michael Jackson's bedroom when he was not on the property, and including staff members who told them, don't go in there when he's not here, and they just ignored them and went in anyway. There were other witnesses who testified that on occasions when Michael Jackson was not on the ranch, they saw the Arvizo boys walking around the property carrying pornographic magazines. And there was one guy who actually testified that Star Arvizo left one of the magazines on one of the amusement rides that he'd been on. So what this all added up to, essentially, was quite a large number of unimpeached defense witnesses whose stories taken together suggested that the more likely explanation for the boys knowing about the pornography being in Michael's room was that they had been going into his room without permission, in defiance of explicit instructions not to, when he was not there, rooting through his room and had found it independently, and had then been seen carrying the contents of the briefcase around the ranch when Michael Jackson wasn't even there. And in fact, there was a moment in Star Arvizo's own testimony where he slipped up, because he said something about, I forget what the context was now, but he said something about...
No, I remember. I think I know what you're referring to. I think Tom Mesereau, the defense counsel for Michael Jackson, showed him a magazine, a porn magazine, and asked him if that porn magazine was the one that, in fact, Michael Jackson had showed him to groom him. Star Arvizo said, yes, that's the one. And it turned out that the date on it was August. So it was long after they had left Neverland Ranch. In other words, they couldn't possibly have been shown that magazine because it wasn't in circulation. It hadn't been printed at the time.
That did happen, but it's not what I was going to say. So
okay.
There was a moment in his cross-examination where he said something about blah 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 in the drawer where Michael keeps all of his spare razor blades for shaving his face. And Tom Mesereau said to him, how do you know where Michael Jackson keeps his spare razor blades? And he went, he showed me. I was like, well, why would he show you that? Yeah. So it was clear that they had been going through his drawers in his room. So there was so essentially what you have two boys, right, who are saying, the two Arvizo boys who are saying Michael showed us pornography from this briefcase. They are uncorroborated by any other witnesses, and vast swathes of the rest of their story has been shown to be lies. Or, on the other hand, you have this whole collection of defense witnesses whose unimpeached testimony adds up to a more plausible explanation that the boys had been rooting around his room and found it themselves. So no juror who was taking their oath seriously could possibly have come down on the boys' side on that story. But also there's one other thing. So there was a witness called Carol Lemire. She was never called because Tom Mesereau ended his case early. She ended up never being called, but she actually she had warned Michael Jackson's assistant in around 2001 to get him away from the Arvizos, because she was as I say, she was the lady who introduced the Arvizos to Michael, because her grandson was in the same tap dancing class. And she was so close to the family that she told the investigators that Davelyn Arvizo used to live in her house because she didn't get on with Janet. By the way, the only reason we know all this is because Carol Lemire's witness statements were attached to a motion. They were appendices to a motion to introduce something into the case, because she never ended up testifying. But her witness statements are on the court record. So she said that Davelyn Arvizo basically described Janet Arvizo as a basket case who would force her to go stealing, She was crazy, and sometimes David and Arvizo would be woken up in the night by Janet just beating her in her sleep for no reason.
This is the daughter.
This is the
Janet
daughter,
Arvizo's daughter.
Gavin and Starr's sister. And
Yeah.
she testified that there was one moment where Devlin was in her house and she said something about, I might not be seeing you so much soon because Mum says we're all going to be moving to a house in the Hollywood Hills. And Carol Lemire is like, what? How's that going to happen? And she says, well, Michael's going to pay for it. And Carol Lemire is like, well, Michael is generous, but a house in the hills, a house in the Hollywood Hills, but that's crazy. That's what are you talking about? And Devlin, according to the witness statement, Devlin said, my mum is planning to falsely accuse Michael of showing pornography to my brothers. And she's going to use the money that she makes out of that to buy us a house in the Hollywood Hills. So Carol Lemire says, that's outrageous. Like, what are you talking about? How can you do that? That's an evil thing to do. And then Devlin says, it's only a joke. I'm only joking. I didn't mean it.
Okay.
And so Carol Lemire rings Michael's personal assistant, Evie Tavassi, and says, you need to get him away from this family right now. You need to separate him from this family. And that is the point at which Michael's contact with the Arvizos is severed. And they start sending all these cards and letters about, we miss you, Daddy, where we miss our brother and sister, Prince in Paris, you're our father, blah, blah, blah. It's unclear, because Michael never testified, whether he knew, but it seems likely that he didn't, because otherwise, why would he invite them back for the Bashir thing? So it seems like Michael's staff basically iced the family out. And then when Bashir came calling, Michael unwittingly invited them back into his life. But so of course that ties into the whole pornography thing as well, basically.
Just on the pornography bit, this is something that I've heard and I've read about. I just wanted to ask you whether it's true. Is it true that some have accused the prosecutor Tom Sneddon of allowing the boys to put their fingerprints on magazines during their depositions? In other words, to show that these magazines had been handled by them when the trial actually started, these porn magazines. Do you know if that's true?
It's potentially true. So it was never definitively showed, but what they were able to demonstrate was that in the grand jury, the boys had been handed magazines to look at. And there was no discussion.
Magazine seized from Neverland Ranch.
Yes, yeah, and there was no discussion in the transcript about gloves. So ordinarily, when a witness handles an exhibit in court, they would be asked to put gloves on. And a witness would not know to just put gloves on because they've never been in court before. So ordinarily, somebody in the transcript would be saying, if you just put those gloves on, then we'll hand you the exhibit, right? But there's nothing in the transcript at all about gloves. So it was never definitively shown. They actually questioned some of the grand jurors and they all just said, we don't remember. But it seems likely that they did handle the magazines without gloves on because there's nothing in the grand jury transcripts about gloves.
So if true, that's either negligent, in which case you'd have to believe that a very, very senior lawyer and prosecutor, one who'd been in post for more than 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, suddenly makes a mistake, after all his experience and all his years of service. Or it's potentially criminal, but we'll never know, I guess. Well,
what we do know is Tom Sneddon did have a long history of deliberately framing innocent people, and that's not something we really have time to go into here. But I have done huge amounts of research into his department, and there have been case after case after case where courts have determined that there was very serious misconduct on the part of Tom Sneddon and his department, which amounted to either the suppression of evidence of somebody's innocence or the manufacturing of evidence to wrongly convict them. So he was somebody who was prepared to play outside the rules, generally speaking.
Okay. So then the last case, I beg your pardon, the last claim that's worth examining, and this is perhaps the most salacious of the new claims about Michael Jackson, from the documentary is the one made by Michael Jackson's former publicist, Vince Amon. Now, Amon says that sometime after Michael Jackson was charged, so I guess that would be around 2004, Michael Jackson's personal assistant, Frank Tyson, gave him a Nike bag, which had a magazine inside it. And the magazine contained a video catalog section in which Michael Jackson had allegedly encircled videos he wanted Frank Tyson to order for him. And these videos were of naked boys. What do you know about that? So apparently, when questioned about it by Vince Amon, Frank Tyson said, "This is a phase that Michael and I went through. We used to watch these videos. He'd ask me to order these videos, and we'd watch them together." So this is the claim from the documentary that has gotten the most traction. It's the most explosive claim, and just from experience, when people talk about it, just casual viewers, when they talk about the documentary, this is the bit that they latch onto.
Well, it's difficult to talk about because it's new information, which is essentially coming only from Vince Amon. And so we have not independently seen any evidence of this. What is peculiar about it is that Vincent Amon is claiming that this evidence came into his possession in around early 2004. What I know about Vince Amon is that he was very vocally and publicly advocating for Michael Jackson's innocence as recently as the year 2020. So in around 2013, he contributed an article to a pro-Michael Jackson book, and he wrote in that article that he knew that Michael Jackson had been falsely accused, and that through his experience and involvement in this case, he came to understand the burden that Michael had shouldered in being falsely accused in front of the world. He became quite vocal on Twitter at one point. He was very vocal about Michael Jackson's innocence during the Leaving Neverland period. In 2020, when the film Square One was released, he publicly promoted that and said again, Janet Arvizo was a false accuser, Michael Jackson was innocent, and this documentary is great, everybody should watch it. I am in touch with a researcher who was communicating with Vince Amon more recently than that even, and at that time all he had to say was positive stuff. But now all of a sudden, 20 years later, he is claiming that he had evidence in 2004 to show that Michael Jackson was guilty. There is a big discrepancy there, which is completely unexplained, and it is a dereliction of duty of Netflix, of Channel 4, who have also included him in their version of this show, of The Sun, which has run an interview with him, of Piers Morgan, for example, who had Vince Amon on his show recently. It's a dereliction of duty of all of these journalists who are treating Vince Amon with credulity, and neither highlighting this inconsistency nor asking him about it. So if you genuinely had evidence in 2004, which you now say proves Michael Jackson guilty, and you knew from 2004 that Michael Jackson was guilty, why on earth did you spend the next 20 years publicly advocating for his innocence? It doesn't make any sense. So he was asked
and actually,
Morgan,
Charles,
yeah.
I mean, in the documentary, he refers to it as a turning point. The moment when he's handed this Nike bag by Frank Tyson is a turning point for me. That's what he says. This is the moment where I decide that actually something's going on. This is a turning point for me. I mean, turning point, and I guess what you're saying is for 20 years, this turning point didn't really turn much.
I hesitate slightly to go in too much on Vince Amon because I wonder whether he's okay, if I can put it that way. His behavior on Twitter is sometimes quite erratic and quite manic. It doesn't often make a lot of sense. The things that he writes don't make a lot of sense. He has a website on which he seems to me to be trying to draw some kind of link between Michael Jackson and, you know, like this Middle Eastern governments and the German military. And there's this whole conspiracy that he seems to believe has occurred, which to me does not make sense and would not make sense to anybody of right mind. So, you know, there is a massive discrepancy between what Vince was saying up until a couple of years ago and what he's saying now. That discrepancy is not explained. I hope he's okay.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, then. So then, just to finish off, you know, the first question I guess I should ask is there anything else that's worth mentioning here, or have we covered most of it? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
When we're talking about the Netflix documentary, I think there's a few things that I found egregious. One is the presentation of Louise Palanca, which Channel 4 also did. Channel 4 and Netflix have basically made near identical series about this case, which have come out on top of each other, featuring largely the same people telling the same stories. Louise Palanca is in both of them. There is no mention in either of these documentaries about the fact that Louise Palanca was a witness in this case. She was a prosecution witness, and her cross-examination by Tom Mesereau was, in my opinion, one of the most devastating, embarrassing cross-examinations of the whole trial. I don't have time to go into it now, but she left the stand in that case not looking good. And to platform her in these documentaries without highlighting the catastrophic damage that was inflicted on the credibility of her story by the cross-examination by Tom Mesereau, in my opinion, is ethically indefensible. Nor, you know, the fact that they don't mention that she was actually in a relationship with one of the prosecutors, which is quite significantly important. And there's no mention, for example, of Chris Tucker. Chris Tucker was a seismically important witness who he was effectively the defense's last witness. I think after he finished his testimony, they called a couple of witnesses to the stand very briefly as kind of mop-up witnesses, and then Tom Mesereau ended his case. And it was because Chris Tucker's testimony was so catastrophically damaging to both the Arvizos and Tom Snedden, and the prosecution generally. So Chris Tucker testifies basically that he met Michael Jackson through Gavin Arvizo, and they became friends. So, and he talks about how the Arvizos were a terrible liability. They were constantly hitting him up for money. They would abuse his hospitality. There was one time he flew them out to a movie set. They were completely poorly behaved. They disrupted the filming. They cost money to the production. They then refused to leave the hotel and basically ran up a massive bill that he was paying for. And then he testifies about how after the Bashir documentary airs, the Arvizos contact him and say, you know, this is a disaster. We're all over the TV. The press are trying to get in touch with us. We're being hounded. Michael's in Florida. We need to get to Florida. And Chris says, well, I'm going to Florida anyway. And they say, well, can you take us on your jet? And so he does, right? He takes them to Florida with him, which again that's also a massive nail in the conspiracy charge, because one of the overt acts of conspiracy is that Michael Jackson has the Arvizos transported to Florida, which is, you know, again, is that a crime, buying someone an air ticket? No, it's not. But if you're Michael Jackson and you're charged with conspiracy and you buy someone an airline ticket, you're going to prison, right? But anyway, it was actually Chris Tucker that flew them to Florida. And he says in his testimony that they were behaving really, really strangely. The mother was in histrionics, was shouting and screaming and crying about Michael is the father of my children, and you're the brother of my children, you're our family, we love you so much. And then the kids are like, oh, we don't have a car, our car is broken down. You have lots of money, Chris. In fact, you've got multiple cars. You could probably just give us one of your cars and you wouldn't even notice you didn't have it. And then they start asking him for a specific truck. They're saying, there's a particular truck you have. You could just give us that truck. You wouldn't miss it. You're rich anyway. So he's feeling very uncomfortable about this family. So he gets to Florida, delivers the family, brings them to the resort where Michael is staying. And then he goes into a room with Michael and he says, Michael, there's something seriously, seriously wrong with this family. You have got to get rid of them. They are nuts. They've spent the whole time I'm with them asking me for money, asking me for a truck. The woman is going berserk, like some kind of, religious fervor and saying about, I'm the brother, you're the father, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, so that's his testimony. He is then cross-examined by Tom Snedden. Tom Snedden, again, like I said, he has had numerous rulings against him by courts that he and his department have engaged in very serious misconduct. He has also been dogged for years by allegations of racial targeting of people, the abuse of his office to target people for racial reasons. He is cross-examining Chris Tucker, and he shows Chris Tucker a photograph of himself and Michael. And Chris Tucker just kind of jokes, he says, that's quite a nice picture. Maybe, do you know where I can get a copy? And Tom Snedden says, if you're a good boy. And apparently, from multiple people I've spoken to who were in court, this moment, this white prosecutor telling Chris Tucker that if he's a good boy, he'll give him a photo, just sucked all of the air out of the room. It was awful, and Snedden just kind of stood there for a minute, and maybe he was thinking to himself, I shouldn't have said that, maybe I should apologize or whatever, but there was just this horrible, ugly silence that hung over the courtroom. And then he just carried on with his examination as if nothing had happened. And Tom Mesereau said that by the end of Chris Tucker's testimony, the combination of how devastating his evidence had been for the credibility of the Arvizos and this incredibly ugly moment where the prosecutor had made this racially loaded comment and just let it hang in the air, he said that the atmosphere in the courtroom towards the prosecution was so sour and ugly that he felt he would never get a moment like that again if this trial continued. So he had a month's worth of witnesses still on the bench ready to be called, including Carol Lemire, and he just took a decision in that moment and said, this is it, this is the moment, and he rested his case. And of course, it was the right decision because he got unanimous acquittals on every charge. But that moment in the trial was so important, particularly because so many people felt that Snedden's obsession with Michael Jackson was in some way racially motivated. And to leave that out, when you're supposed to be making a serious documentary about this trial, and you leave out that the prosecutor of this African-American defendant made this comment to the African-American witness, you just don't mention it. You just cover it up. I mean, that's egregious. That's really egregious. It was so important that it actually caused the defense attorney to end his case. Because he said to me when I interviewed him, I felt that at that moment, that jury was ready to acquit. And if I kept them there any longer, if I carried on calling witnesses, they would actually start to hold it against me, because it would be like I was just detaining them from returning to their lives, and they might actually punish me for it. So it was seismic. Chris Tucker's testimony was absolutely seismic, and to just ignore it and not mention that it happened is so outrageous, really. I just thought that was a terrible, terrible omission, and is actively dishonest, in my opinion, for both Channel 4 and Netflix to omit it, because it really was vitally important to the outcome of the trial.